Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is May 3rd, 2029, or 2021, excuse me. And tonight we're going to be continuing our review. We're almost done. We have one more chapter after this of the journey of the heroic parent. Chapter 8, we're talking about boundaries. I'm going to cheat a little bit tonight because I'm going to add things that weren't in this chapter that I've written since then or thought about since then. But I figured no reason to kind of keep that a secret and save that for another broadcast. I could talk about boundaries and codependency for hours, for days, because in a sense, it really is the kind of building block of relationship. How do we relate to each other? How do we see ourselves in relationship to each other? I think it gets too complicated and complex. I think it's very nuanced sometimes, and I think we can simplify it and make some of what I'm talking about tonight very, very practical and accessible. So the first thing I want to say before I start is that everybody, every human being is on the codependency continuum. And remember that codependency, I call it co-participation in this chapter, the codependency and co-participation, that there's two important things at the outset to remind you of. First of all, they're not clinical terms. They're pop psychology terms. And the reason that that's important for you to hear is because you're really just talking about a sense of self. You're really talking about your earliest attachments or those patterns that come out of that attachment. So codependency for pop psychology, for self-help literature, if we were talking about it in more clinical terms, we'd be talking about it in terms of attachment styles, attachment wounds, attachment trauma, attachment figures, and kind of how we've made sense out of ourselves in relationship to our earliest attachment figures, and then playing that out for the rest of our lives with other people. So that's really what codependency is. It's our attachment style and our attachment patterns. And the fact of the matter is that when people ask me, is this codependency? I think an important idea to start off with is that just assume that everybody has these issues. And I can't emphasize this next point too much. And that is that your level of codependency, your fracture around attachment or attachment patterns, your co-participation, it is not a perfect predictor of your child's mental health. I have seen people that are less codependent have children that definitely could benefit from treatment. And I've seen people that are much more codependent who have children that probably will never end up in treatment. And so we have to extricate this idea of codependency from some kind of causal idea around addiction or pathology. And again, embrace the idea that we all struggle with this. In fact, the more aware you become, the more aware you are of your codependency. The less aware you are of yourself, the more likely you're to grade yourself low on the codependency scale. So that's just what I wanted to say at the outset. Now I'm going to start off with some slides that come from, like I said, that come from some things that I've written since then. I'll talk about boundaries. This came from a post that I did sometime last year around 5 principles of boundaries, or 5 keys to boundaries. The first key I wrote was boundaries are not for changing others, but derived from a parent's sense of self, as in, this is what I feel good about, this is what I need in this situation. Most people, when they're asking me about appropriate or healthy boundaries, in the back of their mind, if not the front of their mind, they're saying, what way of relating to my child can I adopt so as to fix my child? What's the right boundary to teach this principle in this lesson? And when we think about boundary, we have to shift our perspective from this idea of cause and effect, this idea that the child is just an extension of you, this idea that all of the child's woundings is evidence of some pathology in you. And I know that might sound like it goes against some of what I teach because I ask people to look at themselves so often, but there is a distinction and a nuance between understanding your contribution, your impact on other people, and taking kind of a position of cause and effect. So boundaries, when you think about boundaries, when you think about boundaries with your children, with your partner, with people that you work with, it's not about fixing them. It's really about self-care. It's really about an investment in yourself. Key number 2, don't make it about being right, but rather about being a self, as in, quote, I may be crazy and old-fashioned or an idiot, but this is my boundary. This is the most powerful position we can take, and it sets an example for children in resisting peer pressure. This is a really simple but difficult and lifelong pursuit for at least me, and I assume for all of you. We have to extricate ourselves from this idea of being right and good. I've said this before, that I was just talking to my wife 15 minutes ago. We were comparing our own processes today. And I was saying, it's all the same thing. And she said, what do you mean it's all the same thing? And I said, we're all defending against being bad. We want to be good. We want to belong. We want to be lovable. We want to be desirable. We want to matter. And that so much of what we do in this world is to defend against the fear and anxiety that those things might not be true. To defend against experiences that suggest to us that we aren't lovable, that we aren't worthy. And right and wrong, at least in the family I grew up, and unfortunately in the family that I've raised, that becomes this kind of marker of whether or not that you're good. I think I've shared with you all a book that I just read by a gentleman by the name of Charles Eisenstein, but I'm going to repeat it again because it's had such a powerful impact on me. This is a gentleman that I think he has a different background educationally, but essentially is a philosopher. And in the book that I just read, he's talking about climate change and global warming, but not in the practical everyday sense about carbon emissions or about deforestation. He's talking about how it's a manifestation of our individual spiritual issues, right? He starts off with, what causes climate change, and he starts talking about carbon emissions. He says, yeah, but what causes that? Where does that come from? And then he talks about consumerism, and he says, yeah, but where does that come from? And then he talks about the spiritual emptiness that we feel and how we try to fill it with these things. So it's really a spiritual issue, of which the effect on the planet is just the outward manifestation of it. But at any rate, after one of his lectures, he goes around the world lecturing on global warming and this kind of spiritual connection. A woman walked up to him afterwards and said to him, how can you justify speaking on the issue of climate change and yet flying all around the world in airplanes trying to do this? You know the impact of air travel on the environment. How do you justify flying around on airplanes when you believe in this work so passionately? And his response to her was, I don't justify it. And she was shocked and confused by his response. And he said, I do it because I like it. I like to do it. And then she said, well, what if everybody did what they liked to do? And she asked him that question. He said, I think the world would be a much better place. So he has found a way, at least in this story, and I'm sure, I know from his writings that there are other times when he falls into the hole. He had found this way to pull himself out of the story of right and wrong. Just recently, I had somebody that I know in my personal life do something, send me a message that was hurtful. And I wanted to write back to them, my defense, my argument about how what I did was they misinterpreted me and I didn't intend, all of this explanation. And I remember Charles Eisenstein's story about I don't justify myself. And I thought, if I engage in the debate, the justification argument, I've lost. And so I decided to write back and say, I'm sorry, and I'll do what you've asked going forward. The minute we enter the debate about being good, we've lost. The minute we try to establish our rightness, our goodness, we've lost ourselves. Key number 3, similar to key 2, don't explain your decision or the boundaries to your children in an effort to get them to agree or be okay with the boundary. Don't say, I'm doing this for your own good, or I'm doing this because I love you. Similar to the Eisenstein story that I just told. When we establish the clearest of boundaries, right? Boundaries that come from the source, if you will. We don't make our case. I put in this quote in bold and italics, I put, don't explain your decisions to your children in an effort to get them to agree with it or be okay with it. People always ask me, but can't you explain your boundary? You can. But if it comes from a place of trying to get somebody to win somebody over to your side, you've lost yourself again. I used to ask this question, and I've shared this on the podcast before. I used to ask this question about what's the difference between an explanation and a justification. And I give people a chance to think about it and give their answers. And the answer is, an explanation isn't necessarily a defense against a threat. A justification, a rationalization, an intellectualization has inherently in it a feeling of feeling threatened. My worth, my goodness, my rightness, my lovability, my likability is threatened. And one of the simplest ways to know which you're doing is if somebody interrupts you or stops you in your explanation, you're okay with it. But if you feel this compelling need to tell the story, to explain it, then you're coming from a place of being wounded, being hurt, and defending against a threat or a perceived threat to that wounding. So this is an aspiration in the subject area of boundaries, getting to a place where it's just what it is. Key number 4, listen to them, the other person, as much as you are able. Respond with genuine empathy and allow them to be angry, hurt, or upset with you and your decisions. As in, quote, I get it. You're angry and upset and it makes sense. I'm sorry this is so hard and I'm glad you're telling me how you feel. Or you can just simply listen and be silent. An assertive, clear boundary from a healthy place, from a healed place, means that we also allow the other person to feel and think what they're feeling. That's really what they mean in Al-Anon in recovery when they talk about letting go. Letting go is about letting go of control of the other. Letting go means that my actions, my statement of truth, my expression of boundaries is the end and not a means to an end. That's really important. The boundary itself is an end and not a means to an end. This reminds me of my 18-year-old son a couple of years ago when we let him know that he'd be going on a adventure therapy program over the summer. He wasn't quite clinical enough to go to a wilderness program, but we weren't happy with the amount of screen time. And so we let him know he'd be going somewhere and he could help to kind of choose some of it, but that he'd be spending at least 30 days without screens, without electronics, doing service and kind of stretching and growing, or at least having the opportunity. And he said to me at one point during this conversation, he said, what if it doesn't work? And my answer was, I don't really understand the question. It can't not work. The opportunity that we're providing you is the goal. We're providing you the opportunity by doing this. And how you respond to it is up to you. But our boundary, sending you to this program, this creation of this program, our boundary is innately what we want it to be, which is an opportunity. Key number 5, don't use your emotions to try to get children to change or other people to change. When you do this, you're telling them, telling the other person, the child, that your feelings are their responsibility. This will lead them to believe that what others think and feel about them is theirs to manage. For example, don't say, quote, I am angry, scared, or hurt as a substitute for boundary setting. Because we were parented this way, because on this planet that we live on, the majority of human beings make other people responsible for their serenity and well-being. This is what we were taught. I will tell you that I'm upset, whether you're my spouse, my friend, my employer, my coworker, my employee. I will tell you that I'm upset, and then it will be your job. I will imply from that that it's your job to do something different so that I don't feel these unpleasant emotions. You can feel them, they're valid. You have to find a way to take care of them, to manage them, to share them. Often not with the person, especially if it's a child, but somewhere you have to take care of yourself. And then you can come with a clear boundary. You can get some clarity and say, here's what I will and won't do. And lastly, I say this. Lastly, we can say that we are sorry when we fail. Every parent has limits, and every child will discover the end of those limits. We can say sorry when we fall short of the ideal, and with this, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all, what it means to be human. It's really, really important that this become a part of our understanding of boundaries, because you and I are human. And you and I will leak, and we will lose ourselves, and we will get triggered. And if the world and our children are depending upon us to get it right or perfect, everybody is doomed, right? Your children are doomed. Really, our jobs, as I see it, are to teach them how to be a human being, because most people don't learn that. They learn how to be good, they learn how to be right, they learn how to be successful, but they don't learn how to be a messy, imperfect human being. And so at the end of the day, this is a way that we can teach them. The epigraph from this chapter says, codependency is co-participation. If we are to contribute to the health of our children, whom we love, then we need to focus first on our relationship with ourselves, then with our children. Only then can we see the relationship with our children's problems, right? We understand how we are dancing with them. It's not a cause and effect, it's a contribution. But oftentimes we are contributing to the very thing that we're complaining about. Over and over and over again in therapy, I discover this. This idea that the thing that we want to see stop, we are actually contributing fuel to that dynamic. And the shift in this chapter is to focus on self-care, to focus on self, to understand where you stop and they start. I was thinking about differentiation today. In fact, I was talking to Travis Slagle, our clinical director of our intensives program, and we were talking about these ideas of boundaries and co-participation on one of our clinical calls. And I was describing this idea that differentiation, we were talking about this idea that differentiation is the balance of separateness and connection. In higher levels of differentiation, one separation doesn't rob individuality doesn't rob connection, and connection doesn't rob or steal from individuality. There's this kind of coexistence. I can be empathic, sensitive, aware, listening. I can see you, and I can remain separate. So many of us human beings are so flooded with an empathic ability, right? We're so overwhelmed. A therapist just told me last week that when he walks into a room, he can feel everybody's feelings. One of my mentors said when they get on an elevator, they know how everybody's doing on that elevator. And because we get wounded from our attachment figures, we're told that that's a strength and an asset, and it is, but it's also a liability. We become overwhelmed, we become triggered, we feel guilt, we feel shame when we do something that we think causes suffering. And so we end up in relationships where it's not very clear where I start and you start, right? I'm responsible for your feelings and you're responsible for me. I'm responsible for your sadness and happiness and you're responsible for mine. The shift in codependency, the shift in co-participation is I'm responsible for my feelings. My serenity is my responsibility. And I can listen patiently and sensitively and empathically to you, but I'm not responsible for your feelings. It's a shift from this kind of fusion that we think of. And that fusion can look volatile and reactive. Somebody's short to, in any kind of conflict, to walk away from the relationship, or it can look very dependent. So stylistically, codependency can look dramatically different, but the fundamental core issue is the same. In this chapter, I talk about a young woman who says her father is just going to shut down when she shares something with him and walk away. And I commented and said, I didn't know your father was that fragile. And she said, fragile doesn't fit at all, she said. My father's a rock. And I said, I know it doesn't look fragile, but his inability to stay in discomfort and conflict in a relationship, to be so reactive, is a kind of fragility. It might not look like dependence, right? Anxiety, but it is the same lack of separation. It's just that his solution is more masculine. His solution is looks more angry and looks more rigid. But it's the same issue. I wrote this in this chapter. While teaching and in service to our therapists on how attachment theory can inform us in repairing poor attachment for our clients, a therapist interjected. What I see in most families is over-identification or over-attachment rather than a lack of attachment. I explained to this therapist that over-identification is the most severe form of poor attachment. Over-identification doesn't see the child as an other, but rather sees the child as an extension or a reflection of the parent. In such a relationship dynamic, there's only one person, the parent. The child is altogether missing in the parent's mind. So not only do we have attachment wounding and modeling that's poor, but we are taught by our culture that over-identification and over-attachment, anxious attachment, that's love, that's closeness, when really it's abandonment. It's not purposeful or conscious abandonment, but it is abandonment. It is an inability to see the other person as another person. If the child or the other becomes simply a mirror to you, reflecting back your worth, you've lost connection with that person. And if we anxiously over-attach to somebody, over-identify with somebody, we're not really connecting to their humanness. And so one of the reasons why I like to talk about this idea is that we are taught that this is too much of a good thing. In The Audacity to Be You, I expand on this a little bit more, and I say anxious attachment is not being too close, but really it's about not having enough self, not having an adequate and sufficient sense of yourself. It's clinging to somebody else. Like my daughter Emma Reedy taught, a quote that she came up with recently, she said, codependency is the illusion that you're taking care of other people when you're really taking care of yourself. We are begging and pleading and sucking dry others. And we believe the delusional idea that we're loving them. And that's very confusing on the other end of the equation, because all we know is that it feels smothering. From Alice Miller, we developed this way of co-participating with each other in an effort to avoid pain, fear, rejection, or isolation. But as adults, we don't need it anymore. In the book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, the author Alice Miller writes, when we realize that all of our lives we have feared and struggled to ward off something that really cannot happen any longer. It has already happened at the very beginning of our lives. Children, in this sense, can't abandon parents, right? They can't contain you. They can't heal your attachment wounds, and thus they can't abandon you. Now, children can cut themselves off from you. They can stop talking. They can leave and never come back when they become independent adults. All of that is possible. But in this psychological sense, that's not abandonment. It is only we who can abandon them. And so much of what we're trying to prevent in our relationships is we're trying to prevent something that already happened. And that's why a deep dive into your own family of origin and your own wounding will uncover that the problematic ways that you're participating in relationships with your children and with the people in your life is born out of this unhealed, unexplored wound. It is so very common for us to give others what we need and to call it love, to call it support. That is a hallmark of codependency. The development of codependency may start with the reinforcement we receive when we show care for our parents at the expense of our own needs. I mean, just that sentence, I could stop there, but I won't, because we have more time. I'm going to read it again, though. The development of codependency often starts with the reinforcement we receive when we show care for our parents at the expense of our own needs. When we sacrifice our truth to take care of them. Then, when we become parents ourselves, we unknowingly require our children to take care of our emotional needs, to take care of our serenity, our peace of mind. We tell them of our upset, our disappointment, our anger, our sadness, our frustration, and our fear, with the implicit ask that they behave in ways that don't trigger those feelings. We reinforce codependent behaviors when we discourage a child's anger and frustration towards us because it feels threatening towards us. Over time, the child's worth thus becomes linked to the ways he takes care of others and simultaneously denies any expression that threatens others. He doesn't know how to be a person. He doesn't know how to be him. He just knows how to interact with other people's wounding, because that's what he learned from us. We do this as children because the cost of not taking care of our parents is rejection, shame, and abandonment. Put simply, the child equates praise for love and connection. If we do not take on the parent's needs, then we experience the withdrawal of affection. And then we go out in the world and realize that's our job, is to take care of other people's needs and not ours. We get told that when we take care of ourselves, we're being selfish, which of course just isn't true. Furthermore, in the book, The Narcissistic Epidemic, one of the ideas that the authors present is that the children who are overly concerned with the approval of their parents and later become parents themselves tend to be overly concerned with the approval of their children. It's a very common critique of parenting culture today to say that in previous generations, when we were young, children worried about what their parents thought about them. But today, parents worry about what their children think about them. And the point that I make is the same person doing the worrying. They just grew up and had children. Because if you believe what your parents think about you is about you, you're going to transfer that onto everybody else in your life, including, and maybe most intensely, on your children. Oftentimes, their children will learn that pleasing behavior is the only way to function in their relationships, and they too will search for the approval of others. So we pass on this narcissistic wounding over and over and over again. When your child says something like, "I don't trust you," or "I don't think you're really listening to me," you can say, "Wow, thanks for telling me." Now, I'm going to pause here because I don't think I make this story as powerfully as I do now. I made this story in this chapter as powerfully as I do now when I'm teaching. You have your limit, right? You can step away. You can walk away. You can say that I've had enough. But notice all of those expressions are about you taking care of you, about you admitting your limits. And that's really the shift, right? We don't say, this is for you, I'm doing this for your good. We say, I'm doing this because this is what I need to be okay. And so many people say, well, isn't that just the child taking care of you? And of course it's not. It's you taking care of you. When you can show, and I'm just going to use this word to emphasize the point, when you can show that you can be selfish, your child learns that they don't have to take care of you anymore. When you're unavailable because you're at an Al-Anon meeting, or you're watching a broadcast with me, or you're doing a weekend with your friends, when you learn to let your child down because of your own self-care, the child learns that you're safe. See, folks, I get so excited about this because it's so clear and so universal. The universal wound that we're treating in our parents and in our students. And of course, there are an innumerable amount of details that go along with this, but the constant is this narcissistic wounding. This idea that really happens in practice, that the child is taking care of us. So the detachment, the pulling away, even sending your child to a wilderness program like ours is an emblematic moment of saying, you go, and I'm going to work on myself here. And you can be mad about me, about that. You can resent me. When you threaten that you'll never forget me, I can't be held hostage by that. In fact, I know I taught you to do that. I taught you to do that. And in a real sense, I am betraying the family ideals. Because I'm sending you there, I'm going to take care of myself here, and you get to hate it and be furious about it. So if you take care of yourself and you have enough in your stomach, in your emotional reservoirs, your psychological and spiritual reservoirs, you'll be able to say to your children, I'm really glad you told me you don't trust me. I'm really glad that you're telling me that I hurt you and that you're angry. I hear it. And what are you teaching a child? You're teaching a child to go out into the world and to be who they are. They won't end up in relationships where people gaslight them, talk them out of their feelings, tell them why they're wrong. It will not appeal to them. It will be a kind of a relationship that they would never be attracted to. So as we heal codependency and learn to dance with our children differently, they learn a new way of being. And they'll recognize that difference in others. I have a handful of bullet points here. I told this story when my oldest son, who is now 28, was going away, was moving away. I was sharing my grief and sadness, this is my firstborn, with my therapist. And I said, I just want him to know that I love him so much. And she says, he knows exactly how much you love him. And I thought, that's true. There's nothing I can say in the 2 or 3 days before he leaves that'll change his experience of my love for him, however big and imperfect it is. And it was very comforting. And then after a pause, my therapist said to me, and he needs to get as far away from you as possible. And it was not just relieving, it brought me joy. And I thought, she's right. He does. He's 19 or 20 years old. He needs to go away. And I can do that for him. I can do that from a place of love. Another story about differentiation. I was at a wedding breakfast many years ago when I was younger. And one of the folks during a toast at the breakfast said to the bride and the groom, if you're not fighting with each other, one of you is an idiot. That's much different than the common advice, which is don't go to bed angry, which is insane. right? The idea of not going to bed angry will lead to some long and difficult and ugly fighting sometimes. If you're not fighting with each other, one of you is an idiot. It's okay to be different. I borrowed the phrase in the new book that says, one of the things that you will help you understand me is that I'm not you. And when you understand that I'm not you, everything else will make sense to you. Sometimes we tell our children to not feel our feelings. I have the opinion, I read a lot about gaslighting these days. Gaslighting is it comes from a movie in the 1930s with Ingrid Bergman about a woman who marries a murderer. And she starts to suspect her husband. And so to try to throw her off the scent, he starts turning down the gas lights in the house to make her feel crazy and acts like nothing is happening. And I read things all over the internet on gaslighting today. And people really do put a lot of effort into suggesting that it's a very narcissistic, almost sociopathic thing. I will tell you right now, I've never met a parent that doesn't gaslight their children. I've never met a person that doesn't gaslight somebody in their lives. Gaslighting is the most common way we respond to each other until we get into therapy and start to do a lot of work and understand our own wounding. Look on the bright side. You're being selfish. You're overreacting. I didn't mean that. Consider my intention, and you won't be so upset. Children are often told to look on the bright side, stay positive, to be happy instead of angry or hurt. These mantras arise from an incapacity to watch family members and loved ones suffer and struggle, especially when that suffering and struggle comes because of something we've done. So when you think about gaslighting, yes, there are the overt examples, and yes, the movie, I think it was like in 1938, is an extreme example. But the fact of the matter is, I would guess that every one of us has gaslit somebody in the past 24 hours. I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I would be surprised if that weren't true of all of us. We learn when we're young that our needs don't matter. We learn that our feelings don't matter. We get taught by our context that our feelings don't matter when we get gaslit. Care for your children, I write, but also model independence. Show them that it's okay to take care of yourself, oneself. I say this all the time. Even when I train therapists, I say this comment. It's really important that you learn to let other people down. Really important that you learn to let other people down. If you don't do it, you'll end up in these codependent relationships. And you'll model for them that you can't take care of yourself, that it's their job to take care of you. This next bullet point, there is a typo I just noticed. It should say healthy detachment equals healthy attachment. Years ago, I was asked the question, what about, you talk about healthy detachment all the time. What about connection? What about attachment? What about reconnecting to our children, to others? And I had to think about it for a few days. And I went through my kind of logical process of, okay, what is healthy attachment? What's the opposite of healthy detachment? And I realized the opposite of healthy detachment is not attachment. The opposite of healthy detachment is unhealthy detachment. And healthy attachment, is the exact same thing as healthy detachment. I'm going to say that again because it's the simplest and most straightforward point I can make in this whole broadcast. Healthy detachment and healthy attachment are the exact same things. Like I said earlier, independence and connection don't rob each other, don't steal from each other, both coexist. That's the idea. Unhealthy attachment or unhealthy detachment, that's the opposite. The problem is in some kind of philosophies like Eastern philosophies and Buddhism, attachment is a negative thing. That's a different subject. That's a different use of the word. Buddhists teach that that attachment to things is the cause of suffering. And then we have to learn to let go. But in psychological terms, that's a part of healthy detachment and attachment. A healthy attachment means that I let go. It means that I love without control, without management, without trying to manipulate. It means that I see you and accept you and embrace and resonate with you and who you are. I think that's one of the reasons why it's confusing. What does codependency recovery fix? It fixes you. This goes back to the first few minutes of tonight's broadcast. To the extent that you fix, recover, heal your own codependency, your own attachment wounding, your own confusion around boundaries, to the extent that you fix and address those things, you will not necessarily fix or change anybody else. Now, over time, the people in your orbit, including your children, do tend to notice a difference, and it does tend to have an impact on them. And the ripple effects, like a stone that's dropped in a pond, starts to reach out from where you stand. But innately, the only thing that your recovery will fix is you. People ask the question so often, will my child forgive me? Sometimes they ask it in general. Sometimes they ask it specifically about sending the child to a program like this. The question itself is evidence of some attachment wounding. My answer to the question is, will your child forgive you? And my answer is, when they grow up. You can't not hurt your children. I think one of the greatest gifts of being a parent is that you have to become accustomed to failing at the most important thing in life. I think that's one of the benefits of marriage. And there are other examples, but thinking of marriage and having a child, being a parent, there's nothing that matters to you so much that you will fail at more. And so your child, if they're able to grow up, will learn to forgive you for the things you did on purpose, on accident, the things you thought were helpful, the things you just simply acted out on them because of your own trauma, and the list goes on and on and on. And if you get held hostage by your child's lack of forgiveness or threat to not forgive, again, you're handing over to them the responsibility for your sense of self. I'm not saying this is easy, and I'm not saying just because I can present this, I have it all figured out tonight, because I struggle with every single thing that I'm talking about tonight. This is my work. And while I was introduced to a lot of this in graduate school, one of my first presentations actually in a psychology course in undergraduate school was on codependency, and I've been thinking and working about it ever since. But it's still something that I'll work on. I've said and joked with people, if I ever arrive at the finish line, I promise I will let you know. I'll turn around, I'll rest, and I'll let everybody know what it feels like to have arrived. I end the chapter with, I really fell in love with Broadway, and I give my wife credit for this. She tricked me into watching the musical Wicked in Los Angeles many years ago when it was playing for a few years. I wanted to go to a baseball game, but I was going to a lot of baseball games anyway. She said, just try this. I'd never been to a Broadway level musical. And at the end of the first act, right, just before the intermission, the main character, Elphaba, sings a song to the wizard. And the last words in the song, or in the verse, are, he's asking her to collude with him, to kind of rule with him, to give up her integrity, her sense of self, what she believes in, what she thinks is right. But what that will bring for her is acceptance and love and adoration, because he'll support her. And the last lines of the song were, well, if that's love, then it comes at much too high a cost. And that's really the shift out of codependency, is that we arrive at a place where we're not willing to give up who we are to belong. And in healthy relationships, we're not asked to give up who we are to belong. So let's talk about some take-home messages. First of all, a hallmark emotion of codependency is anxiety. Anxiety is the common cold of human beings. And when children have anxious parents, they interpret it as that something is wrong with them. It's a biological need. If I cause you to be upset or anxious, you might leave me. I can't get nurturing from you. So I learned to manage your anxiety. Lie to you, be a good child, do the right thing, make you happy, don't confront your defenses, don't tell you I'm upset, angry, on and on and on. Children internalize parental anxiety as something is wrong with them. I'm not saying anxiety is unfounded or unnatural or you don't deserve to have it, because your children are doing a lot of things that would cause any parent who loves them to be worried. But the key is you have to take care of your anxiety yourself, not them. So you have therapists, you have mentors, you have group members, you have peers that you trust. You have a journal, meditation, whatever it is, podcasts, webinars, support groups. And you show your child that you will make your anxiety your project so that they don't have to. The child's development is dramatically impacted by our fears and anxieties. And for those of you that are really anxious and beating yourselves up right now because you know that you're anxious and you're hurting your child, that's not the solution. That's still part of the problem. Right? The way out of this cycle is out. When the woman asked Charles Eisenstein, the story that I told you earlier, when she said, how do you justify traveling by air flight and speaking about climate change, he said, I don't. I'm out of that story. We learn to let go of outcomes, and when we learn to let go of outcomes, we're more honest. When we learn to let go of outcomes, we do better with self-care. We stop lying or manipulating. We stop selling to our children our boundaries, selling to them that it's for their own good. We let them have their reaction. And over time, pulling this away from parenting a little bit, over time, the more authentic that we can become, the more authentic that we are, the people that end up in our lives around us are people who don't need us to sacrifice who we are. And that means you're going to lose some people. But the ones that stick around, or the ones that you gain, those are people who really are capable of loving you. You learn to throw. I was a Little League pitcher. I was too slow to go beyond Little League. Man, that first baseline, that's a long way. 90 feet, I think it is. It's a long way for a slow guy like myself. I'd be thrown out from the outfield every time if I went on to higher levels of baseball. But I digress. As a pitcher in Little League, you had to learn to let go. Right? If you started aiming it, maybe some of you have played tennis or golf, or you've tried your hand in art. When you're afraid and you try to control it, you do worse. But when you trust your throwing motion, when you trust your practice, right? When you let go, you become much more powerful and impactful. One of my favorite books on this subject is a book called Art and Fear. My son, who is an artist, gave it to me. I've told the story before, but one of the authors taught ceramics in college, and he separated the class into two groups randomly. And he said, this group over here, the first group, you're only going to turn in one project at the end of the semester, and that's your entire grade, will be that one project. And this group over here, you're going to turn in all of your finished products, and I'm going to put it on a scale. And the weight on the scale, the mass of your finished projects will be your grade. And then at the end of the semester, he remarked that all of the great art came from the second group. I'm working on and finishing another book right now that I'm co-writing with a couple of people. And I was working on part of it again this weekend, and I was editing as I went, trying to write the perfect paragraph, the perfect start, the perfect transition. And I had to remind myself, Brad, that's not how you write. There's an old phrase in writing that says, write drunk, edit sober. To create something beautiful, you have to let go. To throw strikes, you have to let go of aiming. Like I said, these all go back to your attachment issues. I've shared with you this quote that I've become fond of the last couple of weeks that says, unless we realize that we are wounded and traumatized children who were raised by wounded and traumatized parents, till we accept that, we will continue to abuse the people in our lives. Because we're going to try to be something we are not, something perfect, and they're going to need to support that agenda. So it's really important to go back to your attachment issues. I've been doing this for 25 years now, running a wilderness program for 25 years, and now running intensive programming for the past 6 years. This is it. This is the work. You work on your stuff. I believe in our program. I believe that the children who come here benefit and need it, and might not in many cases be safe unless they were here, might not be open to the process unless it were this compulsory. I believe that. Having said that, this is the work. This is the work. You work on your attachment wounding. You work on your therapy. You work on your family of origin. You work on the patterns that you live, that came to you from your early experiences. You make your development of self your project. I think if there's one thing I could hope for from every parent that goes through our program, especially the ones that come to intensives, it is that you realize what your project is. And it's not fixing the kids. People hate being the project. It feels shaming to be the project. It feels stifling or smothering to be the project. It doesn't mean we abdicate our parental responsibility. It just means that's not where our energy and anxiety lies. You just have to do that because it's your responsibility. But you're the project. You're the problem and the solution for the suffering in your life. And if your children's well-being is a solution to your life, think about that burden. Think about the cost. Think about how, on top of their anxiety and mental health issues, their realization that they're hurting the person that gave them life, that loves them the most on planet Earth. Think about the shame and extra weights that they carry on their shoulders. So when you make your life the project, you take that burden off of their shoulders. They still have their stuff to work on. Some of which was a contribution that you made. Others came from other places, other people, circumstances. But you take off that additional pack weight, if you will. I mentioned the stylistic differences. There is what we call a masculine. Don't hear the word male because it's not the same. The masculine style is aggressive, combative, controlling, intimidating, anger, shaming. The feminine, don't hear female because it's not the same thing. The feminine version is dependency, over-reliance, subjugation of all one's needs for the other person. And while the styles might look very different, and men and women have both masculine and feminine traits, it's the same core issue. A lack of self, a lack of differentiation, and a lack of capacity to relate to others as an independent self in empathy and love. And then lastly, that we're all on the continuum. If you said to me, are you codependent? My answer is, of course you are. How do I know? Because you're breathing. The question becomes, what's your style? What are your Achilles heels, if you will? What are your triggers? What are the wounds that you're acting out on others? What are you taking from other people that you're not aware of? And all of those questions become your life's work. They're my life's work, our life's work. So we're all on the continuum. It's not a binary. It's not you are or you aren't. You are. And if you think you're not, you're probably more. And if you realize you are, you've accomplished half the battle, half the fight. All right, I'm happy to take any questions. Somebody writes, you said your therapist said your son needs to get as far away from you as possible. Can you explain that more? I felt like you were saying more than the normal time for him to grow up and find his own way thing that people say when their child leaves home. I know I talk in kind of extreme ways to make my point. Sometimes I think it's a little bit too provocative, but that's what I meant. I had to see the value in him getting away. And all of my children, well, I've only had 3 that have moved away. All of them have gone far away to college, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. That's where my 3 children have gone so far. I have one that's still in middle school. And then they all come back. And not because I needed them to, not even because I wanted them to, but they came back because they wanted to. But yeah, it's probably more like you said. I just say it in kind of an extreme way to emphasize my point. And my therapist knows me, and she said it in an extreme way to kind of drive the point home. Somebody writes, thank you for talking about gaslighting. My 18-year-old has recently told me that I gaslight him. I admit that I didn't believe him and have felt a lot of shame around this comment, but now I recognize that he is right. I identify with consider my intention, and you won't be so hurt. By the way, I don't know who wrote that because I can't see your names. Such a great gift. That's what being a good enough parent sounds like. It's not even not doing it in the first place, which, by the way, is impossible, just an illusion. It's recognizing that you do it, having enough sense of self to be honest with yourself and to see how and that you do dent your child. That's the goal. That comment is the goal. Thank you so much. Somebody writes, there's one piece of what I've learned from professionals that in my experience doesn't play out in real life as it does in theoretical interaction. When talking about setting a boundary by ending a conversation when my child was being disrespectful to me, for example, is an assumption that the conversation will end just because the parent says it will. My experience when the child was younger was that he would follow me, throw things, pull out a knife, kick me, you name it. He would do anything to keep the engagement going. I wouldn't leave the house and leave him alone at 5 years of age. And I was not going to call the police on a 5-year-old. My experience is that it takes both people to agree to end a conversation, and that if you have a relentless kid, they find ways to box you to keep you in the conflict, to keep the conflict going, and the parent ends up trapped. I think in some situations you're absolutely right, and in other situations it's a slower turning barge. Right? These are not hairpin turns. So in some cases, your child might be that extreme, might have that level of what you're describing as mental illness, right? Dysregulation, volatility. And children do have that. And they come with greater or lesser traits in these areas. So you're right. This is only true in kind of what we call the long arc of our lives, right? In the long arc of our lives. Somebody says, can people really recover from codependency? I mean, it's a journey. I mean, like I said, it's not an arrival. Recovery means that you're working on it. Recovery means that you're owning it. Recovery in some way means that you're still struggling with it. So it's not recovered. It's recovering. Last question. How does trauma influence and affect attachment? Trauma, in essence, is a fractured attachment. Trauma is a situation, circumstance, behavior, or treatment where the child or the individual is not seen and held adequately. Some kind of harm, abandonment, violence, inappropriate behavior. Sometimes it's just death and loss. Right? There are no villains in psychology. Charles Eisenstein said, and I quoted him last week, when we start to understand that this new story that he calls inner being, as opposed to the story of separateness, that we understand that evil is a consequence and not a cause. Evil is a consequence and not a cause. All right. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, we just finished chapter 8, is available on Audible and on Amazon. Also, The Audacity to Be You is available in those same places, and the audiobook is in my voice and is out now. If you want to do a deep dive, an immersive dive into your own work, the next in-person intensive is April 28th through May 2nd. You can go to our website and look there. We've changed the structure a little bit so that in-person Finding You is one program, and then we have it broken up into two parts online, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is family of origin. Part 2 is your present day work. And then returning to you means that you've been to a Finding You and you're coming for a revisiting of your work. We have pursuits and venture trips that are available for young adults or families. We're going to have some some set programs for this summer, but you can also use this for a 3 to 30-day program for a young adult or for family. Think of Therapy Light. Think of reconnecting to your work. We have support groups online for wilderness families and alumni. The next one is May 6th. That's this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And the next intensive support group is May 11th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. This is another free way, and you can do it virtually, where you can work on your stuff. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. AdultChildren.org is an excellent thing that I would encourage you to try out. Because all of us come from dysfunctional families, because every family is dysfunctional in the way that I'm talking about things. Adult Children is learning to navigate and understand the impact of your childhood issues, of your family. RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired program, and NAMI.org is a program that has chapters in your local area, free resources. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast platform. Just go to your podcast app on your smartphone and search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast, or you can also go to SoundCloud.com on your computer. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or you can find @Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives, and of course our blog has new content each week. The next webinar will be Wednesday this week. I'll be doing 2 this week, and I'll be just taking live questions and answers. Anything left over and any live questions that evening. You can invite the siblings of your children or any of your extended family member and friends. If you want to introduce them to this work, please feel free to share with them and have them attend. If you need more information, email webinar@evoketherapy.com. And I'll see you Wednesday night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for and on behalf of your loved ones and your children. And I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Take care, folks, and I'll see you Wednesday evening at 6:30. Bye-bye.